I used to be really worried about the screens, but after hearing sort of Hope's experience at A&I in Baltimore, it was just like, yeah, I mean, of course, if somebody's really not doing anything between 6 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock the following morning, there's a problem. But I think there's really this drive inside of people that if they know that there's somebody there watching and caring about them, that they'll be okay. Mm-hmm. And I felt like both Andy and my daughter Sarah, they learned that they could learn. And they, you know, if he's already, how old is he? 8. And he's writing code. Yeah. It's like,
yeah,
he's learning that he can learn by himself, mm-hmm. and that's just an incredible, that's more important than anything else he could learn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm relatively familiar with the research on video games and cognitive development. And I don't think it's either good news or bad news, because what the research is very mixed. Nobody agrees on a consensus. So the doom and gloom sells, and that's why that's most of what we hear. The doom and gloom is that it does things to their brain, it decreases sociality, it does all that. But if you look up either books on Amazon or research in like academic libraries, you look up video games brain or video games cognitive development, you see as much research on the other side. There are researchers who found that it either doesn't do anything to like social skills, it doesn't diminish them compared to people who don't play games very much, or sometimes it actually improves empathy and things like that. So they've also found that. And the problem is that there's no real answer there yet because there's just no consensus about what it is. But what I will say also is that, you know, a lot of folks up here have said it's a totally understandable fear, and it definitely is. But what I'll say is every generation, if you look historically, has kind of had fears about whatever the next technology is. So there's a really great story in one of Plato's early dialogues of Socrates. Socrates is talking about how scrolls, the invention of writing scrolls, will be the death of memory. Because so people used to memorize speeches. Right. And his fear was that, well, this is going to be the death of like thinking, because people will no longer have to memorize speeches, so they'll read stuff. And of course he was absolutely correct. It totally diminished people's memory for memorizing speeches. People didn't do that anymore. But what he neglected was the fact that they actually did a whole bunch of new stuff. Because now that you can read stuff, you have information, you have other processing skills. And if you're to ask me personally, I would suspect that that's what's going to happen with video games. So there will be diminishment in some things, but there will be gains in other things, and we don't even know what those other things are yet. And I think the last thing I should say about video games, there is a lot of research in video games and learning, and part of the reason is because researchers are realizing that video game designers have inadvertently stumbled across these learning principles that schools just can't replicate. So think about it this way. There was a video game design book I read at some point that said, you know, people think that people play video games because they're easy or because they're fun. And really, it's because they're really difficult. Like, you can't sell a video game unless it's really difficult to play. Like, we are designing this thing that's supposed to be so frustrating that you just can't get enough of it, and it's hard work, and you fail and fail and fail. But somehow we've designed these things where people love it. And schools don't do that, of course. So I guess what I'd say in terms of like kids playing video games, I mean, they're doing a lot of challenging stuff. So if you think about the challenging stuff that goes into video games, and the fact that they're going back and going back and going back, that's a pretty cool thing. That's a pretty powerful thing. So, you know, the fear is understandable, but I'd also say like looking at the positive side of it also doesn't come as easy to us, I think, just naturally. So that's what I would say about it.
So I think I already sort of shared, but some other thoughts that came up, just more generally, like I think it brings up a bigger question about how we spend our time and who gets to decide how we spend our time and what's an addiction and and those are all like big cultural questions that are just reflected in like parenting in general. Having a 4.5-year-old, it's like I'm constantly thinking about all that stuff, right? Are we spending enough time not watching his favorite show? Or you know, what am I doing wrong, right? Something like that. But some comforting stuff that I have read in the last 4.5 years, I think the one that stands out is the Freakonomics study that said it doesn't really matter if they did a study and they were like looking at outcomes for kids and trying to pin it down on like how the parents had like what they had read and what they'd done, and it turned out that it didn't really matter whether or not you only had to be a parent who had bought a parenting book to be a better parent. You didn't actually have to read the book, and so I take that as some comfort. Like, oh, I'm thinking about how much time he's spending watching TV. That's a good start, at least. So, because you have to tell yourself something. So.
You must be excellent then, because we have a crap load of books.
Totally.
Yeah. So me personally, growing up, I hated technology. Well, also we didn't have a lot in the house growing up until I was a little bit older. But I remember like until I was, I don't know, 16, we had a TV and it was on one of those rolling carts, and it hung out in the corner of our living room with a blanket over it, so you couldn't even see it, with like no cable. So I was like, I don't know. We got faster internet at some point. We had dial-up for a while, but I can say for my brother, he was more interested in technology. That was much more his thing. I don't think he was always super into it. There was something, it was just about something that you're really passionate about. So my parents like homeschooled these two kids. My brother was always incredibly studious. He read a lot. He would like sit down at his desk and like learn math, whereas like I took that course and never finished it. Pretty much all I wanted to do growing up was like run around outside and like play with sticks and mud, and like collect pretty flowers. And that's pretty much what I did for a lot. I was part of this homeschool group at West Point for 8 hours a day, where we just like ran around and like collected pretty stones and learned edible plants. And I feel like that could also have been really terrifying for a parent, being like, they're not learning anything, you know? Like, I mean, like, how is that, like, my parents had to embrace the fact that that was just something that I wanted to do with my day, was running around and playing with sticks. And eventually that led me to where I am now, was like this fascination. They just kept on encouraging me in the things that I was passionate about and giving me more avenues to explore it. So I was interested in being outside, so they signed me up for like athletic things outside and this program at the Eno outside, and I went outdoor. I went to Schoolhouse of Wonder pretty much I did camps the entire summer, like solely at Schoolhouse of Wonder. And that was, they facilitated that, and when my interest sort of morphed, they facilitated that and gave me new avenues to explore that new interest. And so technology is sort of this newer thing where your kids might be super interested in it, and there are probably so many cool ways where you can facilitate that interest into maybe something else. So I know there's a lot of like gaming camps where you can go for a summer and game, but also they learn about programming, and they learn, like, it sounds like your son is interested in coding, and that's super useful, and that's a great skill to have. I obviously don't have it because I hated technology for most of my life. But I think it's amazing when a kid expresses something that they're interested in, and then they're just given the tools to learn more about it. Because again, I think it's really negative when teachers just sort of say, this is what you need to know, here, know it. And there are kids that might not want to know that information or care about it, and then it's really hard on them. And then they're labeled as ADD. But yeah, I think it's like there's obviously all those studies, and I think it's important to like see daylight. But I also think there
Just two very quick things, and I'm so grateful for this. This is just really teaching me a lot too, because I don't enjoy the technology, and I always struggled with it myself. So this is really, really helpful. Couple things. Kaya and Aosha and Kaylee Rose, but particularly the boys, it had such a profound experience with being in the natural world, in the living world. It's like, I cannot imagine like a better teacher. That might sound a little cliche, but it's just being in the living world, I think, is so important for children. And I think that being on the screens and everything can just take them away from that. And there's a very visceral, alive experience that I always want to be a part of what our children are experiencing. So that's, kind of, where I'll leave that. But then I remembered what I was going to say about the parenting, and that is that some people have this idea that unschooling is kind of unparenting. And there's this like inner struggle with that, but actually unschooling means you're super parenting, like you are right there. And it's kind of what you were saying, just even thinking about how you're going to be present and a good parent and how you care is like, 95% of it. So.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to say about the screen sort of stuff because I was never really, I mean, there have been times when I've been sucked into it more than I would have liked to, but it was never really a priority for me. But I think, your fear is definitely valid with all that. But I think if you feel like there's a good balance, or at least some sort of balance right now, because that is obviously his passion. That is obviously the thing that he wants to be doing, and you should support that.
Their passions evolve though, because it's like he started out with like dinosaurs, and I was like, if this kid doesn't become a paleontologist, it's gonna be because he memorized every little thing. And then he went through a phase where he was super into the Hamilton musical, and he had the book and memorized it, and then he was like very into American Revolution. And now he's like into Minecraft, so it might be a phase, but it might not be, and it's interesting just to see how it evolves.
With a lot of kids, they go through a lot of phases, and I was pretty stuck in one phase of just wanting to be outside, and that's all I wanted to do all the time. But I've seen people who cycle through those kind of things.
We are good about getting outside.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, if you feel that you're good about getting outside, like, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
He's
I
going
guess
through a phase.
the nagging fear is just like concern is how much freedom to give them within that. I was with unschooling. How much unstructured time do the kids have, or do you kind of structure their day?
The way that it worked, at least I remember with me, just briefly, was we had to finish our schoolwork or other activities before we were allowed to have this time. That was our free time to do computer time, and when there was that computer time, it was limited to X amount of time. So it was like, once you finish these things, you've got this hour or whatever of free time. You can do whatever you want with that on the computer, and then after that, we're going to find something else to do. So something like that was the way that it worked for us, and I didn't like it. As a kid, I remember I didn't like it. Now looking back, I think it was definitely a very good way to go about it, because I had to finish. All my schoolwork before I was allowed to go on and do something like that.
Yeah.
And we were still very unschooled. It was very free form, but there was that little bit of all right, if you want to have your computer time, then I'm going to need you to finish this brief little assignment or whatever. And it was never anything huge, but just I think it was that struck a good balance. It was just feeling like I had to finish, accomplish something before I could get to move on to what I just wanted to relax and do what I wanted to do. So.
By the way, in terms of unschooling literature, the idea of someone spending many, many weeks intensely doing this and then doing it, it's absolutely common and typical. One of the things I think that schooling has done to us generally is gotten us thinking that learning is you do an hour of this and then you do an hour of this and then you do this for a few days and then you move on to something else. And all of the learning studies I've ever seen in terms of learning in a non-schoolish structured environment show that that's not how it works. It works by you do this with intense focus, whether it's learning magic and illusions, or whether it's learning, you're spending out time playing with sticks and mud or whatever for a long period of time, and then that transitions into something else, and then you do that for months, and then you do this for months, and that's just, as far as I can tell, it's actually quite unnatural the way we do it in school in terms of how learning.
Thank
It
you.
seems very normal to have.
Thank you.
Also, it takes 10,000 hour,
To
work
combine.
hours to become a professional on anything.
Of a certain type of practice, yeah.
I
Yeah,
wanna
obviously.
just
But
moderation note, in about 10 minutes I want to do a closing round, and I want to include everybody in the closing round, and that's what we're talking about.